Off the Grid is a brand new BR that has tons of detail and depth to it that people don't really realize. At its very surface level, Off the Grid is a general BR with a bit of emphasis on movement shooting and a bit of an emphasis on certain abilities that can be used in conjunction with that movement shooting. But if you look below the surface, there are some very interesting nuances that Off the Grid is utilizing to create depth in not only its gunplay, but also its movement systems that allow a general skill gap that I don't think we've seen in lots of BRs before. And if you're wondering how you can go from a zero in Off the Grid who's struggling with certain gameplay concepts to a pro who's utilizing every single advantage to their possible ability, then this video is for you. I have a bunch of hours in Off the Grid now. I have a win percentage that's through the ceiling of around 55% plus, and a 5KD that is constantly rising. And all of that's just been from the progressive process of learning more and more what Off the Grid is capable of doing, and how you can utilize certain gameplay segments to get better at the game. I have a whole video covering settings as well, which is a separate video, which I will leave linked here that you can check out. And that's definitely something I'd recommend, especially for controller players, because there are some very interesting settings. But in terms of understanding how the in-game systems for Off the Grid work, not only in terms of animations, but in terms of how your movement affects your shooting, this is the video for you. And the first thing I want to start with is just a general basis of the skill gap in Off the Grid and how it is created. Then I'm going to show you some very key examples of simple things that you can add to your gameplay that will make you a better player. The biggest metric of Off the Grid skill gap is creating distance and closing distance. And this is understanding the times when you should push an opponent and the times when you should break out of a fight as fast as possible. And the people who are able to utilize this basic concept of learning when to get in and out of a fight are the people who win most frequently in the game. And it's why we have achieved nearly a 60% win rate. The misconception with this game is that Off the Grid just has all of these movement mechanics, when in reality those movement mechanics exist for very simplistic reasons, to get in and out of fights as fast as humanly possible and escape them where you can. It is why I absolutely recommend either using the Roadrunner legs or using the Leaper legs. They are critically, without a doubt, the most important movement assets in this game that will allow you to get into fights faster, but also get away from fights faster too. And it's learning the fact that once you hit a plate break on an opponent, you have maybe 2 to 3 seconds before they are replated to exploit that gap. Whether it's closing the gap with a zipline, closing the gap with leapers, closing the gap with the fast legs and the roadrunners, whatever it so happens to be, you have very limited windows to operate in. Because this is a third-person shooter, the second somebody gets into cover and starts healing themselves or starts plating themselves, it means that they flip the situation on its head, because you can be firmly behind cover and hidden while still being aware of where your opponent is whilst healing yourself. This isn't like a first-person shooter like COD, where somebody who is behind cover also kind of has to look around and re-engage their opponent. You have full spatial awareness in this game. So a lot of the reasons that I'm able to win and lose gunfights is just how quickly I can close distance when I've landed some shots and the numerical advantage is in my favor, versus how quickly I can get away from a gunfight when that numerical advantage is flipped against me. And in almost all of those scenarios, using Leaper legs or using the Roadrunner legs is 100% a guaranteed way of success. And then the secondary elements of those skill gaps rely around using third person to the best of your abilities and also using the abilities themselves. Being able to use third person in cover is a really important thing. You should be switching shoulders often, you should be using that third person camera to scan your surroundings, and more importantly, you should be doing all of that from a position of power and a position of cover. Third-person shooters allow you to sit in hard cover positions that keep you completely safe from your opponents whilst understanding everything that's happening around you. And if that isn't the basic fundamentals of how you play this game, then you're doing it completely wrong. Think Ghost Recon, think any other third-person shooter like SOCOM that you've played before, the same principles apply here. You should always be in cover, you should always be hiding your character model, and you should always be doing those systems whilst utilizing that third-person camera to scan your surroundings. And then finally, we have the abilities. Things like the phosphorus arms, the javelina arms, the ability to call in mortar strikes. These are things that directly focus on third-person gameplay systems and BR gameplay systems. The phosphorus arms, for example, are a fantastic way of forcing somebody to leave cover so that they don't have a third-person peek as advantage. And the javelin legs that allow you to call in a mortar strike on your opponents are a fantastic way of addressing the Battle Royale elements of this game, where people camp in certain scenarios or gain height advantages. All of these systems exist to undo other systems. The phosphor arms exist so you can force people out of cover, the mortar legs exist so you can force people out of power positions, and when you utilize those in a skillful manner to your benefit, you will be flying in this game. I'm now also going to show you some tailored examples of simple things that you can do in this game that will greatly improve your gameplay. The first thing a lot of you people need to understand when playing off the grid is that the gunplay is far more complex than you realize and has a lot more nuance to it than just being a third-person shooter. I've had a lot of people telling me that the hit reg in this game is challenging or bad, but in reality, it's the fact that the gunplay makes the gameplay in terms of shooting very, very challenging in ways that you wouldn't anticipate. So I'm going to give you two examples of this and a couple of ways that the gunplay generally happens to suffer. The first is spread from standing and crouch. So I'm just going to shoot at this target wall here, and this is when I'm standing, and this is when I'm crouching. There is substantially less deviation between your shots and recoil when crouching compared to standing. So that's just a very simple one. But this one is going to surprise you. This is what your aim looks like in terms of your bullets landing when you're moving. Now this is what your aim looks like when you're moving your crosshair and not moving yourself. The spacing between your shots generally when firing your bullets while strafing is absolutely astronomical, and if I strafe side to side, you could really see just how much of a gap there is, an almost uniform gap between my shots when strafing left and right. So generally speaking, shooting from left to right with your crosshair as opposed to strafing left and right is a much better system. Now, if you're firing on a medium to long range target, this is really important to understand because it means that utilizing less movement and crouching is substantially more beneficial. If you're firing a target close range, strafing is obviously key to avoid being hit yourself, as well as crouching, jumping, and just generally increasing your movement mechanics. But the reality is you're going to be needing to compensate far more than you realize. So for example, if I'm firing on a stationary target like this character here, a simple crouch and duck will get them killed really, really rapidly. Now, the same kind of target in the same kind of location, it takes a lot longer when moving left to right, just because of the gaps and spacing in the bullets, and just how many more shots most players will miss on a moving target compared to a stationary target. So it's really worth knowing that movement massively affects your aim, as well as jump shooting. Something a lot of people have been making the mistake of is that if you shoot like this and then you jump, you are massively increasing your spread, and you can actually see it on the crosshair as you do it in real time. And if you're somebody who slides often or somebody who goes into a crouch often, you will also see increased spread while sliding. This does reduce once it's finally completed the animation, but those are just a few examples of how your general movement will massively affect your gunplay in-game. And this is one of the reasons lots of you feel the netcode isn't that good, when in reality the hit reg is fine, it's just the spacing between your shots. The next big thing I want to touch on is off the grid's movement system actually has a lot more depth to it than people realize, and a lot of it is down to how quickly you can pull your weapon out on an opponent, and some of it is just about the nuances of a third-person shooter. And I want to talk about these things in terms of how they can get you killed, and also how you can do them better. So I'm going to give you a few examples, and there's also a few things about how your aerial combat works that's going to greatly improve your gameplay. The first thing that I would say 100% you should avoid in off the grid is what you're seeing right now, which are these very fixed, clunky animations for mantling that should be avoided at all costs. Whether you're using a jetpack or a grapple hook, you want to utilize those more to get into power positions, as opposed to a fixed animation like this, which takes about 2 to 3 seconds for you to draw your weapon. One of the things I'm seeing lots of new players doing as well is, let's say I'm fighting this guy over here, and he knows I'm using this as a piece of cover. If I try and mantle over the top to re-peek him, he's got a good 2 to 3 seconds to shoot me before I even get a shot off, which means I'm always going to lose that fight. But the nuances to the movement system go so far beyond just mantling, and a lot of it actually has to do with the jetpack system. So I'm going to give you an example here in terms of how just a basic change to your gameplay can greatly increase your odds of winning a fight. Now I'm going to use my leaper legs here and go into a general flight path, and I'm going to hit the ground at a really sharp angle. And by hitting the ground at a really sharp angle, it introduces a roll animation, and that roll animation takes me out of the ability to shoot back at my opponent for a fairly extensive piece of time. But Did you know that if you happen to manage to go into this booster animation and you shoot upwards towards the end of it rather than hitting the ground at a harsh angle, you can actually completely get rid of the roll animation. All you simply have to do is angle your character upright and then let go before you hit the ground. If you hit the ground at a really sharp angle, you're guaranteed to go into a roll animation, whereas if you manage to kind of level out your flight path, almost like a plane going into land, you can guarantee that you're never going to get that animation, and you can instantly just pull out your weapon and engage an opponent. And all it takes is just making sure that you are facing upright and your boosters are facing towards the ground by the time that animation's completed. And this just guarantees that every single time you fly into a gunfight, you're ready to go instantly, as opposed to hitting the ground really sharply, doing a roll animation, and then having to try and get into combat. Now, there are a couple of other incidences where you can actually avoid those animations entirely too, and you kind of just saw it there when I hit the floor. Now, if you actually happen to jetpack into something like a fixed object like this wall, you don't hit a roll when you hit the ground. You just hit this animation where you kind of get stuck in midair, and that's a really good way of also avoiding getting caught in this fixed roll animation when you land on the floor. So a really good way of doing that is just finding a ledge, something like this, and you just fly into said ledge, and then you come out of the animation. And it stops you from doing the roll on the floor, and it stops your character getting stuck on the ground. So those are a few simple ways that just changing the angle at which you're hitting the ground greatly increases how frequently your gun is actually available to be used, and completely ruins anybody's opportunity of getting free shots on you whilst you're stuck in a fixed animation. Another sort of minor, interesting, nuanced detail is that depending on which arm you happen to be using for an ability, it will actually affect the camera that you're utilizing at this given time. So I can swap shoulders on any given occasion, and in any third-person shooter, you should be doing this very frequently to gain a peeker's advantage, which means you're keeping your body in cover whilst being able to look at your surroundings and using your camera to your benefit to identify where opponents are. Now, if I press Q, or L1 for those of you on controller, it's going to use my left arm. But if I swap that to E, it's going to use my right arm. And it means that you can change your peeking angle depending on what you're doing. And this also means that you can wrap these abilities around objects better than you can. Now, if you decide to use the left arm and then switch camera to the right camera, it's going to do that. It's going to get stuck on a fixed object because your arm naturally is kind of clipping around that object at the time. Whereas if I hold E on something like this, I can get my arm around this object whilst maintaining myself still in cover more and generally use my peek's advantage better. And a lot of things I'm seeing generally from players at the moment is they're just not realizing that third person means you're hidden. If I'm here and somebody is standing out that elevator shaft, they cannot see me. So until I make my presence known, they likely won't know I'm even here. And this is something hugely beneficial to general players who are new to third-person shooters. Cover is your best friend. Cover to cover, moving cover to cover, utilizing peeker's advantages on pillars like this where you can just see what's happening around a corner without having to commit to any fight yourself is the #1 rule of thumb on winning every single fight in this game. If I see two dudes running down this corridor, I can hide behind this little barrier here, switch out my phosphorus arm, hit one of them, peek back round, challenge the other, and boom, I've got 2 kills without leaving the comfort of a single piece of cover. And one of the reasons you're seeing me use Phosphor Arms generally quite a lot on stream is Phosphor Arms and other abilities like the Javelina or even the Javelin Legs that allow you to use general utility that force players out of cover is hugely important in a third-person shooter. If somebody decides to hide behind a box or a container and it's really hard to get them out of this piece of cover like this doll here, I could very easily utilize these general pieces of equipment to create an explosive in their area and reduce the safety of their environment. And it's one of the things that generally third-person shooters struggle with and people who are new to them struggle with is just the concept that cover is king. And if you can mitigate that cover by utilizing movement to get around it or using utility to compromise it, then you're in a really good spot. I really hope you enjoyed this video, folks, and if you did, drop a like, drop a thumbs up, let me know how you thought and felt about it. This is a really important first step in getting people up to speed with Off the Grid. And before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my channel members who have hit the join button below, which you can do right now if you so wish, and support my page directly by becoming a member. Members get access to lots of cool perks and benefits and information way before anybody else, so make sure you sign up yourself. As always, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.